Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast alternates between an episode where I unpack some scholarship and an interview. This week's particular episode is an interview with Sofía De Jesús, and in this interview we discuss Sofia's book, which is titled Applied Computational Thinking with Python, Design Algorithmic Solutions for Complex and Challenging Real-World Problems. We also discuss the importance of bringing your full self into the classroom, designing for equity and inclusion, working with individuals one-on-one rather than teaching to group averages, problematizing grades in education, collaborating with educators, and so much more. As always, you can find links to what we talked about in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com or by clicking on the link in the show description in the app that you're listening to this on. And with that, we will now begin with an introduction by Sofía.
Hi, I'm Sofía De Jesús. I am currently a middle school computational thinking teacher. And that means that I teach everything from web design, circuits, game design, Python courses, and such for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I do teach all 3 grades, currently teaching 7 different electives per trimester, which is a lot. But I do love to offer different kinds of things to students. So that's what I do. I have also been published in the last year. So I published the book, Applied Computational Thinking with Python, with Pact Publishing, and my co-author, Dayreen Martinez. So we have that book out, and it's just a book for anybody who's learning Python or has learned Python but is having difficulty with applications. So it's full of examples and what do we do when. So it's mostly about the process and then what Python language we would use to solve that particular problem, which is an exciting thing because it is written by 2 Latinas. I'm Puerto Rican and Dayreen is Dominican. So we had a lot of fun getting to work on that book. So that's me. I also work in curriculum. I have a part-time gig where I am currently helping spread some really amazing curriculum for Carnegie Mellon in Spanish. Mostly that's my role. And I will be joining them at the beginning of July as a full-time employee there.
I'm curious, is it for students or is it for teachers and how to teach students, or both?
It's kind of a little bit of both. One of the things that I say often, and I've had a couple interviews about this, is that I had a lot of trouble learning programming in general and get stuck because I could go through the courses and ace the courses. But when it came to now, how do I apply this? I always gave up because I was like, I don't understand any of this. I understand the loops. I understand what this means. I just don't know how to then create a game or solve a problem for a client or some similar thing. And I realized that I started really loving programming when I had an emergency, for example. So I would be working with a client in educational publishing and they'd need something. And, our contractors were in India and they were sleeping at the time and we needed it in 5 minutes. I would have to look at our coding, try to fix it myself. For some reason, things started clicking when I was stressed, first of all, but also when it was applied. And so I've always been really great when I'm in a really tight time frame, but it was one of those things where things made sense when I had to apply it. So I had already learned quite a few different languages, didn't use them too much. And I realized it's important to not just say hey, this is a loop and this is how it works. And let's talk about it using a couple numbers, which is pretty much every book out there. It'll show you how to iterate while I is less than 100 and then do something. So I feel like that was what I wanted to do. And I think that's helpful for anybody starting up. And I think that's helpful for anybody who's already been in the industry. And it's also helpful for teachers. You can tell it was written by a teacher, I would say. So I think it's for everybody. And it does have samples from let's write a program that will tell you how much a pizza would cost based on the ingredients you have, to let's build a chatbot or analyze a historical document, or there's machine learning. And I'm not an expert in machine learning. Dayreen is. So she helped me out. Those 2 chapters we wrote together, mostly because I don't know the code, but I do know how to write. So she taught me a lot about the code and I helped out with beefing up some of the text in there. And of course, now I know quite a bit about it because inevitably you learn something while you're writing. And then she and I also wrote the 2 last chapters, which are applications only. So there's 15 or 16 problems. There are just applications. This is the problem. Let's solve it now using what we've learned in the book. So that was fun. And yes, it would be for everybody.
Cool. How did you get into computer science education?
by accident. I was a math teacher. So I've been in industry too. So I always say my first program was written on a TI calculator when I was a senior in high school, and that was 1997. So it had a programming button and I wanted to know what it did. So I wrote a program to solve a system of equations. And that was my first program. I did not own a computer until after I graduated college. So there's also that. And we didn't have a lot of computers at the school where I used to attend. It was a really great college prep school, but this is prior to 2000 in Puerto Rico. We did not have a computer lab yet. Our tech class was how to type. So it was a typing class, not an actual computer class. But I spent quite a bit of my time in college going to the computer lab because I just wanted to learn what was out there and what's the internet and what's going on. So I learned to program because of need, I guess, not because of school or whatever. During my statistics course, it was a mix of programming and statistics in college, but that was really not enough. But as a math teacher, when a school needs a computer science teacher and they don't have any and they're just offering one, they grab a math teacher. So when I went back to teaching, which I did in 2012, a couple of years later, somebody said like, hey, by the way, you're going to be teaching a computer science course. I was like, what? So I started just looking at like what's out there and learning it and taking as many classes as I possibly could of the free ones college offered, everything. And I started teaching it and I started falling in love with it. I became a STEAM coordinator at that school, that particular school. And I started learning, I don't know, everything I possibly could about applications. And as a math teacher, we're very married to there's a curriculum and a test you have to take, and therefore everything's like super square.
Right.
Which I didn't appreciate. And I started shifting a whole lot of how I did things when I started teaching again. And I always say that it's because teaching is like when you gain weight, you gain it slowly and you don't necessarily notice it until somebody takes a picture of you and you're like, oh, wait, that's me. And so a lot of teachers don't notice the changes that are happening while they're happening because it's slowly but surely every year something changes. And technology's been like that. But I left teaching in 2005 and came back in 2012 and the classroom wasn't the same. I left a blackboard and chalk classroom and I came back to a smart board and students having computers on them at all times. So I was like, what I used to do doesn't fit. So what do I do now? And I started noticing that students needed more from me than me teaching the content. So when I started teaching math and computer science stuff, robotics and all that stuff, I realized, I could take a lot of what I'm doing in the STEAM classroom. And we do STEAM because it was science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. So it's STEM, STEAM. Some people have medicine at the end, whatever. But everything I was doing and the application seemed to match what my students need more. And so I started changing the way that I taught math as well. Instead of focusing on what does my class need, it was what does that student need? And that's a lot of where my explorations into diversity, inclusion, justice, equity, that work started. So I ended up having to change a lot of what I did and learning more about quite a few different things, not just programming, when I started in the programming classroom.
Now, feel free to answer the next question, like either as a student or as a teacher. But can you tell me a story about an experience in education that continues to impact you today?
There's two things to this. So as a student myself, one of the things that I remember was I was a sophomore in high school and my English teacher was trying to get me to slow down. And we had to memorize something Shakespeare. I was saying my part, and when I was done, she looks at me and she goes, you realize you skipped like every 3 lines. And I was like, no, I didn't. I know the lines. And she's like, okay, so give me these, but say it slower. And when I did, I wouldn't skip the lines. And she said, you got to remember that your brain moves faster than your mouth does. So slow down. And that to this day, I still do. I have to just slow myself down to kind of, what am I thinking? Am I moving ahead too fast? And did I skip something I wanted to say? Happens a lot. And I tell my students that a lot, that they have to slow down, that there's no need to rush the process for whatever that process is. I don't have to just get that done. It's how do I get to that finish line? So as a student, that probably the most impactful thing a teacher ever told me, because I was that student that I wanted to be the first to finish the test, or the first to get whatever. I was very competitive and I want to be the first to whatever. And I've stopped doing that a lot. And I've asked my students to not focus on that, because I don't want them to focus about their growth as compared to others. I want them to focus on their growth as compared to their own growth. So if you were really good at whatever, how do I get better?
Right.
How do you, the individual, get better? Because if you compete against yourself, you're always going to get better. If you compete against others, you're selling yourself short, always, because you're trying to focus on the wrong things. You're not really tapping into your best potential in the areas that are best for you. You're just focusing on the wrong person. So those are things that I like to tell my students. But in terms of impactful as a teacher, in the area of equity, if you're closed down, you're not doing the work. And one of the things that I remember, a student, a senior, we had a professional development day. We were all in tables and there was a student member and then faculty, right? And we were talking, and one of the things that I said was, I'm a private person. I don't want to share anything about my life. I'm here to teach. That senior said to me, but that's not what we need from you. And I asked her, I was like, but why? And she said, because if you don't bring your full self, then I can't either. And it's not that we want to know about your private life or your love life. That's not it. It's about who are you? It's about the books that you read. It's about the music that you listen to. And yes, sometimes some personal stuff, if you're comfortable with that. But she said that a lot of the teachers at that school, which was the truth, only ever shared about the content. And I remember just taking that home. I remember thinking, she's right, but how do I open that up? And so I started doing a lot of work, reading a lot more about what others were doing, and following more professional learning networks and social media, and just exploring what that meant and what that meant for me. And so I would say the last decade has been spent trying to build that so that I can be better for my students, but also sharing that so that other professionals can also say, that is important. We can't just be there for content. Regardless of what age level you teach, you cannot be in the school and be the best teacher you possibly can be if your only focus is content.
So I'm glad you brought up the student shouldn't compare each other. One of the things that you mentioned in your recent session at the Equity in Action Summit for CSTA is that students shouldn't compare themselves with other students. I'm curious, what makes you say that? Or even what led to that shift in your own competitive nature to thinking that students shouldn't focus on that?
In mathematics, we expect that students have all had the same material. So if you're in 8th grade algebra or 9th grade algebra, you should know these things, which is a lie. Nobody ever comes into the room with the same things. Teachers have the assumption that all my students must have these things, and if you don't, that's not my problem. That's a really bad take. I guess I wish I had explored that further sooner. But when I started teaching programming, I realized some of my students have been programming for quite a bit. Some of my students have been writing lines of code or have explored Scratch for years, and they're in 6th grade. And yet, some of my students may see their first line of code in my classroom. They're all signed up for the same class. If I teach that class to the high level, I am not serving any other students. If I teach that student to the base level, those who are really excited about this will get bored and really start hating a topic that they might have loved before. So I can't teach to the course. I can't teach to the content. I can teach to the kids. I can teach creating curriculum that addresses their needs individually. And it is possible, not necessarily the easiest thing. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the ill-defined problem, where you provide this broad idea of what it is that you want. You know what topics you're going to be touching on. So, for example, I have the alternate history project where students are going to explore something in history. It can be sports, music, wars, whatever. They're going to choose 2 topics and they're going to create this game that's a choose your own adventure kind of game, where they're going to explore, if the real thing happened, this is what goes next. But what if it didn't? Then that is an alternate route, right? So it's an alternate dystopian kind of thing, but they have to research who was there, who wasn't. And I mentioned the What if Prince was an actor and not a singer? What happens to music? And it's really interesting to think about because Prince is somebody who's had quite a bit of influence in what comes next. So if he's not there, what happens to music? Are the same people going to be in music? Are the same people going to be inspired? I don't know. But that project will look very different depending on where my students came in. So if I have a student who is a coder and has been doing it for years, their final product might be a very polished game with mini games for decision making and all of that, which is phenomenal because they're going to have enough time. If I give them 3 weeks, they're going to use those 3 weeks very differently from the student who's just now writing their first line of code, who's going to be teaching themselves. And I'm going to be doing some mini tutorials, but they're learning like, how do I use a button and how do I add the backgrounds and how do I add the characters? They're going to be focusing on something else. At the end of the day, they're all going to have practiced about statements, conditionals. They're all going to be looking at loops if they're using controllers. So how do I make sure that my arrow always works or something like that? They're going to be looking at all of those things that I wanted, even though the end result might be, the difference between a stick figure drawing and a Picasso. It's not the same, but they've met the brief. And that's where I want them to be because I don't want the student, who's just writing their first line of code to compare themselves with somebody who's been coding for 4 years. That's what I mean. I don't need them to be doing that. They're going to get there, but they can't expect to learn 4 years of coding that other person has in this one project. And some students really do learn quick and they will be coding at that level. But some students will take the whole entire year to create something that looks more polished. But I don't want them to feel like less than. Their experience has to be about your next game is going to be better. And that's where you need to focus. And if you've already learned these things, then you need to focus more maybe on character creation or whatever if it's a game design class. So I work with my students individually, and as I don't want to be intense about it either. Like, this is what you are doing and forget about everybody else. It's subtle. It's the way that we give feedback to them. It's the way that we prop them up when they're doing something great. And it's continuous. So I am looking at their computers as they're working and I call out something that's really cool on their screens. Hey, this looks amazing. Great job on blah. And it's not about that end grade because I refuse to give grades at this point. But when I did give grades, I also never would give back graded assignments, even with math in my last years. So the last years I taught math, I would refrain from giving back some of the assignments because one of the things that I think affects students intensely is if I give back a paper with a whole lot of red marks, they're not going to want to learn that again, nor will they want to improve. Psychologically and subconsciously, it kills a student. They might start thinking like, I'm no good at math or I'm not good at whatever. And instead, what I would do is I would look at my class as a whole and say, if there's a lot of red marks for a lot of my students, then maybe I didn't teach it correctly. So I would talk to the kids and say like, hey, let's do this again. Let's look at this again. Let's partner up. And I would partner students with somebody who might have done better, but I wouldn't tell them who did well and who didn't. And we would talk more about like, let's look at the content again and let's look at it a different way. And then at the very end, I would say, you need to trust me about your grades. And if you have a question when the grades do come out, then let me know. I've only ever had 2 students actually come to me and say like, I'm not sure about that grade. And we would discuss it and see if there was a change. And I once changed it and the other I didn't. But it was very interesting that the conversations were a lot more about the content rather than the grade. So instead of how can I get a grade is how do I understand this better? I'm having trouble with. So I try to teach my students to focus on the what am I learning rather than what am I getting? And that's all about the individual process. It's about where I am and how's my growth.
So if everybody is starting in a different place and working at their own pace to kind of grapple with these concepts and practices related to computer science, and if you're not teaching to a group average or median or whatever and focusing on the content, what does it look like walking into a classroom? Like if somebody were to step in there, what would they see or hear or experience?
It's interesting because my classroom is active right now. I'm talking pre-COVID. My classroom was a little loud, but it was loud in the sense that everybody was always talking, sharing, but always about content. So there's a lot of people who would stop by and just observe. I used to teach in this room that felt a little bit like a fishbowl because one of the walls was complete glass, and people would stop and just, kind of laugh about the amount of activity in a small room. And that's really what I wanted, because my students will ask each other questions. My students will go like, oh, I'm stuck on whatever, and they'll say it out loud, and either I'll help them, or if I'm helping somebody else, a classmate will. In robotics, there's no way to have a quiet robotics classroom, so that was messy. But my rooms are active. And even now, where mostly they're working by themselves instead of in groups, unless, they're working on collaborative tasks where they can code together, etc. I provide them with ways that they can chat so it doesn't get really crazy with the microphones and people being home and not, etc. It's still a very lively room, and they're always on task. And I can say that because I do have a system where I can see what they're doing on their computers. And we do have a system where they have microphones because I'm teaching remotely. They're in the classroom for the most part. Some of them are home. The kind of hybrid, really crazy COVID world right now. But it is a continuous kind of conversation. And the way that I run a classroom is if there's a tutorial I have to give, my students are not required to listen unless it's something that I know everybody needs. So I might say, like, for the next 15 minutes, or it's usually less, 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to be talking about these things. If you need that content, feel free to just tune in, watch me, follow along. If you are completely sure you're okay with this and you just want to ignore me, put your headphones on, do whatever you need to, because they're working ahead and they're working on something else, or they've already learned that content. So my room kind of just looks like that. There's students talking to each other even while I'm teaching a class. So that might look a little odd to some teachers, but that's what it is. I don't want students to have to be married to the idea of the teacher is talking, because not everything I say is important to that particular student.
Right.
And that understanding is there where I say, ignore me. But I'm also a flexible teacher. I have a class, for example, that just started this trimester, which was game design with Scratch. But some of my students in that class had just been taking game design with Python. And I had 3 or 4 of those students who said, but I want to keep going with Python. So I have 2 options. I can say, no, you must take game design with Scratch, or I can say, like, keep exploring Python and we'll figure out alternate assignments, which is what I did. So now I'm basically running 2 classes in one classroom. I made sure that my administrator was okay with that. But that's the thing that I feel is different, is that I listen to my kids and I ask for their feedback quite constantly. And they'll give feedback on every project that we do. I hated that one, or I love that one. They won't all agree. And I will always say, you have to give everything a chance, and it's okay to hate something later, but we won't all love the same projects. So that one that you hated is probably somebody else's favorite. So we have to give things a chance to develop as we go, because I won't make everybody happy every time of the day. It just can't happen. But those are the things that I think are different in my classroom, is that because it is computer science and because there is such a variety of opinions about what that should look like, I get to explore what my ideal classroom would have been like. And I think that that's what I'm trying to give my students, is an option to explore the things that they're interested in as many ways as I possibly can. And that's why the program that I built at this school, one of the things that I've explained quite a bit to my administrators, but also to other teachers, is that I want a program that's flexible so that when I leave, whoever comes in can change what classes they're teaching, but the philosophy is still there. It's computational thinking. Is how do I approach these problems? But those classes don't need to be looking the same. So if somebody comes in and they're like, oh, but I am so in love with like AI for middle school, well, then teach AI for middle school. If you love cybersecurity, then offer some electives in cybersecurity. They don't need to teach the classes I taught at all. It's a program that should fit with changing technologies, programs, curriculums, and then people can just adjust and adapt as they come in. And as the program grows and adds more teachers, they can keep adding and changing. It's more of a puzzle pieces to be put together rather than this is the curriculum and you must follow it, because I don't believe in that.
Yeah, that all really resonates with like my own approach. Like in the 4th through 8th grade classes in particular that I previously worked with, like if there were 30 kids in the class, they could be working on 30 different projects. They could work on Ruby, Swift, Scratch, JavaScript, like several languages and platforms. Kids could go at their own pace. They'd spend 2 weeks or 2 years on the same project, totally up to them, etc. A lot of those rationales behind those design and pedagogical decisions I was making were centered around equity. And knowing that that is something that is a huge part of what you do, I'm curious, could you like tease some of those out and maybe explain how some of those decisions were related to equity in your eyes?
The biggest one is that kids are individuals. So that's where I start. If my kid is an individual and I have to meet their needs, I need to know that student. So learning to know what they know, where they're coming from, what makes them tick is a big piece of this equity work. So that I try to approach in as many different ways as I possibly can without making it so that they don't want to ever hear the word diversity again. And I say that because it's not just students, but teachers alike. And I try to keep it as equity focused and as individual focused as I possibly can. So some of my assignments will be like, in this unit, we've learned about loops and whatever. Now that you've taken all that in, here is a creative task for you, which the wording creative task is from the Carnegie Mellon assignments, but I use the same philosophy when I'm teaching other classes too, where I will then say, now you have to build something that centers around your favorite place to visit, your favorite food, or something about your culture, or something about your favorite music, something that talks to me about who you are. And in that way, I get to learn a little bit more about my students while they're also learning content in my room. It also makes them think more about who am I actually? And a lot of my students in some of the projects that I've done where, for example, they've created some art piece that is coded, that is inspired by an artifact, so something from history related to their own culture. They have to do some research and they have to talk to their parents and they have to talk to their family members and they have to talk about, this crazy assignment that my teacher gave me. Like, I have to think about how I feel about all of that stuff. And there's a lot of information that you can get from how the student approaches those projects where they're thinking about, bowl to use in the kitchen may have been based on this, African ceramic thing. And I've found that out now. Or, the drums that I love from Puerto Rico, well, me personally, that's something that comes from, slavery and the slaves that were brought to Puerto Rico and how they were able to celebrate their own cultures to survive. And we still use that music and those drums that were created. So we all learn when we're exploring these types of assignments. And in the end, all they're doing is really coding. It's not just coding. So it's that whole piece of, as I'm exploring this coded thing that I'm creating, I got to explore my own history, my culture, and how that culture affects centuries of art and music and evolution from all of these things. And so that's where I think we have so much we can do in our classrooms. Our curriculum doesn't have to be so square. It can't be about those little loops of, print hello world. It's that whole thing that every book, every programming language starts with that print or statement, and why do we do that? And why can't we teach content that explores things deeper? That can be about the individual culture, but it's also about your community. So there's also projects that we can do in the community and understanding what the needs of my building, my community, my groups are, who is part of my community, what's the demographic breakdown of where I am, is that represented? How do I explore that in a project? That's where I want my students to be. And that's where I think we need to go, because this equity work in computer science specifically, we can't ignore the fact that there is no representation. Our students fall through the cracks, and those who make it and study it don't necessarily get the option of working in the jobs that are available. How do we fix that if we don't teach differently? if we don't show them what a female coder looks like, or Black teachers, or Black CEOs who are working in tech companies, we cannot expect them to see themselves as that if there is nobody like that. And right now, I think that part of what I need to do and part of what I want to be able to do is make sure that when I'm in the classroom, I'm having the most impact I can, and how they feel in these areas and how much of themselves they need to bring into the classroom to be able to do that. And I do want my students to bring themselves fully. I don't want them to be filtering out parts of their personalities just to fit into that classroom in any way.
It sounds like coding in your class is almost like a medium for introspection and self-expression. So kids are able to explore themselves and their cultures and understandings, and then use code to express that understanding through some kind of a project. I'm curious, you had mentioned that you refused to give grades. So what do you recommend for teachers when it comes to assessment, which is different from evaluation? So if anyone's listening, those are two different things. But then what led to your refusal to give grades? Because I had a very similar approach.
So my dissertation, which will not be published because I gave up on it for financial reasons, my dissertation was on grading practices. And I will say I started my doctorate in 2007 and then got extensions. I actually could graduate up until 2023. But I started in 2007, having not been in the classroom now for 2 years, not having gone back. So I still very much felt that my dissertation was going to demonstrate that grading was important. I was wrong. And why I was wrong was because I started researching, and the little that existed at that time, so we're talking 2007 through 2009, when I first started my dissertation, what little existed talked about the role of the teacher and having to judge the student and also offering feedback, and how that doesn't really match. So I talked about that a lot. What I ended up having to study later, and I did quite a bit of research on the schools that did publish, like what their philosophies were and such. I found that nobody agrees on what grading is, that even in my school, there were 3 algebra teachers in my previous school, and none of us had the same grading philosophies. So an A in my class had nothing to do with an A in somebody else's class. So if we had a student graduating from that school with all A's, depending on the teachers they had, their preparation was different. So what exactly does a grade give you except an artificial sense of mastery? And so I started shifting from, well, if grades don't matter, because they don't, because people make up whatever they want to about what grades are. And grading inflation was a thing then, because after No Child Left Behind, something started happening where you couldn't give grades less than 50 in a lot of schools, especially private schools. So every time a student got a 0 or didn't take an assessment, you had to put a 50 in there. And GPAs in the 90s, the graduating or entering college GPA, I don't remember which one it was because it's been a while and my data is a little jumbled, but it was something like 3.84. And now it's like 3.95. So what, everybody's a straight A student? Those are the kinds of things where I'm like, sure, everybody could be a straight A student, but it doesn't mean anything. And that's where I got to the point where grades don't mean anything. I want you to show me what that looks like for you. What were you focused on? I want my students, if I ask my students, what did you learn in my classes? I want them to say like, oh, in your class for this game design with Scratch, I was trying to focus on character creation because I'm interested in creating role-playing games. And so what I learned was this. That is a better answer than I got an A. And so I don't believe in grades. Grades tell me absolutely nothing about the individual that's learning, whereas I want my students to have a narrative behind what they do and their assessment of themselves. I want them to be able to explain what it is that they did in my classroom, not just say like, oh, I did great, I got an A. They mean nothing at all. They literally just are there to make somebody happy. Sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's students. And I remember telling a student when I was moving from one school to another, where I said, I'm going to a school that's going great less in the next 5 years. And she said, then how am I supposed to know what my worth is? And I felt we had missed it. What was it that made you think that your worth was based on a grade? That broke me in a lot of ways. And I remember going to the head of that division. I was in a different division there, but I said, I just got this comment from a student. And I think it's important that you know, because we're failing our students if they think their worth is based on a grade. A really good school where they're very, very competitive, and yet elementary school gives no grades at all. Middle school is going gradeless. And actually, the upper school, some classes are already gradeless. And we're still competitive. So what's the point? Why is it that we need to continue to work on saying, but grades are important? They're not.
So if somebody is listening to either going gradeless or just like your general approach or philosophy to education, and they're like, yes, this sounds great, but I have a question about blank. What's some of the typical questions that teachers have?
So I've had quite a bit of questions in a lot of different circles. And recently I had a conversation with a parent not from my school. And he said, but A's were my thing. Like I wanted to get an A, and that's how I became so successful. You know, they're in medicine and top of their game. And I said, but what if you could have focused on your growth? Would that have made it less competitive? Because you're competing against yourself anyway. If you're a competitive person, you're going to want to be better. I still want to beat my top score in every game. I'm just not trying to beat somebody else's score.
Right.
And typically that makes me a lot better than if I was focusing on somebody else, because my height score might actually be better than trying to beat somebody else's. It's just a way to refocus what we are thinking about as success. And I also think grades are empty. We are dismissing a whole lot of people because of their average performance. And I say that in quotations because you're listening and not seeing me, but average performance is actually average to you because you haven't explored what makes that particular person excellent. It tells me that you haven't taken the time to work with that student to be their best self. And I do not care about what your C or A or B means. I care about what does that student see as their success. And I want everybody to understand their successes, because in the real world, sure, there's some who were academically gifted who are doing phenomenal things, but there are some who have been labeled as average who are doing amazing things. It does not matter. Your grades do not matter. You can be amazing with a C, and I do not care, or an F. Who cares if you failed something? In my class, you wouldn't have failed because I don't have that. You fail if you don't do things. And none of my students just not do things. We have to change the focus so that everybody can learn to express themselves individually, so that I can express who I am as a human being rather than who you want me to be.
So one of the counter arguments that I've heard from other people when I talk about grades, similar to what you're just talking about, they've said stuff like, yeah, well, I want to make sure that my pilot got an A on landing a plane, or that my surgeon is really good at understanding anatomy, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, like, how do you respond to people like that who pose those responses?
So there's a ton of research that shows that the people who got the A's are not the actual people who have done exceptional work to figure out different methodologies. Part of the problem and part of the research, and I don't have the quotations with me right now, and this is easily found if you do some research. Somebody who's gotten an A doesn't usually go beyond that A. Somebody who's struggling usually goes way beyond what they need to in order to succeed. So if you're looking for somebody who's going to cure cancer, a lot of those people are not your A people. Some of them are, but a lot of those people are the people that can see beyond, that can look at problems different ways, which is something that you learn when you struggle. So no, I don't care if my surgeon is the A student. I care that my surgeon is the person that's qualified to perform that surgery. And if they are board certified, they are qualified. I care that they have learned my case. They know me as an individual. And specifically because I've had so many instances where I've had difficulty with a doctor actually following what I'm saying rather than what it's showing on the screen. I'll give myself as an example here. When I break things, my joints and my bones and whatever, I don't swell, which means that when you do x-rays, you don't get the typical, oh yes, there's a fracture, because The swelling and the fluid and all that stuff matters when they're doing those kinds of diagnosis. So I actually ended up having to wait over 6 months for my tendon in my elbow to be repaired. I knew I couldn't hold on to a purse, but I wasn't displaying what others display when they've torn a tendon because my pain threshold is high. So I was just like, hey, it hurts. I can't actually like even hold my purse. And they're like, oh, it's not broken. Let's do PT. And I was like, it's not working. There's no change. So it took 6 months for them to even let me get into an MRI machine just to find out I had torn a tendon in my elbow, which is now attached with metal clips. That's happened multiple times. I want the surgeon and the doctor who's going to listen, who's going to say, oh, let me look at your history, which then happened with another doctor who I said, can you just look at my notes? Just look at these last 3 surgeries and then we can talk. I want the people who will do that rather than the ones who go like, but you're not that case, because they're looking at average cases. They're looking at what those rules they have to follow are to be able to make a diagnosis.
Right.
That's not the doctor I want. I want the doctor who's going to look at me as the patient, the individual, my history, and then make recommendation. I mean, obviously I want a pilot who can land a plane, but if they have a license, they can land a plane. Again, those are non-arguments in my book because there's so much discrimination in the medical world too.
Mm-hmm.
That people aren't really aware of. You know, it's the same thing as like the thing that reads your pulse can read yours and mine because I am lighter skinned, even though I'm not white. But a Black person's pulse might not be read correctly because it doesn't see the black skin, the brown skin. Like that's all discrimination because those are the only ones available in the market. And that's what every hospital uses. I want the doctor who's going to say that doesn't work because these things. I want the people who can think through. I want the people who can navigate the other. And that means somebody who can say that didn't work, so let me try this other thing. And that comes with struggle. And that's one of the reasons why I think computer science is important. There is no computer scientist programmer in the world who will say like, I am an expert. I still haven't met anybody. And maybe there are some who say, I'm an expert in coding. Well, everybody I've met will say, I'm just okay, or I'm still learning, or my code is always broken. They'll say like nothing has ever worked on the first try.
Yeah.
Because nothing ever does. You forget the comma there or the semicolon or whatever, and it doesn't work. And you forget to test your code and write 300 lines of code, which I've done, and it's a bad idea.
Yep.
Because then how do you find your error? It's one of those things where computer science is a really safe place to make mistakes. And it teaches our students so much more than this is a loop, because it teaches our students that it might not have worked on the first try, but maybe on the 10th try it did. And I think that that's important because those are the students who are going to be excellent doctors and lawyers and accountants and physicians and whatever, because they're going to look at things in a broader sense. And they're going to look at the people individually. If we teach our students as individuals, they're going to look at us as individuals when we go to their offices and when we ask them for help.
Yeah, I like that. I hope listeners who are trying to make similar arguments against grades will also listen to those examples and be able to use that with administrators who might be reluctant with removing grades or whatever, or grading based on participation rather than product, etc. So yeah, thank you for giving those. I'm curious, like, how do you practice or iterate on your abilities, either as an educator in computer science in general? I'm a bit of a practice nerd. It's a topic that I'm fascinated with. So I'm curious, like, what do you personally do to try and improve?
So there's quite a few different things. First of all, I study. So I like to study. I've been a nerd my whole life, and I'm proud of that. While I've been teaching, I choose 3 textbooks before the summer. And I purchased those 3 textbooks in whatever areas it is that I'm trying to study that summer. And I spend some time not just studying the textbooks, but finding videos about the topics, finding experts in the field to like just explore. And that's one of the reasons why I love neuroscience and child development. I spent the summer studying that. I spent the summer studying psychology. Last summer was not a one that I studied because it was a COVID summer and I was trying to survive, which meant preparing for a year I didn't understand. But the year before, I had brought some books on machine learning and such because I was interested in AI. I understood none of it, but it was fun trying. But that's the kind of thing where I study, but that's the same thing I do for diversity. I don't know everything, and I still try to learn from other people. One of the most recent conversations on a Twitter learning network, we were talking about pronouns, for example. And it came up because one of my students had mentioned something. And we ended up having a conversation about what questions are we asking? Is the right question, what's your preferred pronoun? Or is the question, what pronouns do you use? And not only that, but subdividing it. And we come up with 3 questions, I believe. And it was, what pronouns do you want to use with me when we're talking one-on-one?
Mm-hmm.
What pronouns do you want me to use when your parents or guardians are here?
Mm-hmm.
And what pronouns do you want to use in the classroom, in this classroom? Because those 3 things might actually not be the same, especially in a middle school or upper school, high school scenario. And it gave me a lot of pause to think I hadn't gotten to that point on my own, that I wouldn't have gotten to that point on my own, and that this is still something that I very much need to learn about. And most of us in that group had used a variation, but never those kinds of 3 things together. And one of the things that I think is important here is there are so many people doing this work who are still learning based on what our students' feedback has been, because those 3 questions didn't come from us, the teachers. They came from a student saying, when my mom's here, please don't use that. So when I say that we're still learning, it's not because, that's not an excuse. Our students teach us so much about what it is that they need, that we have to be works in progress so that we can address what those needs are. And because society changes and because we have to adapt. We can't just stop and say like, oh, I'm great. I am an equity expert and I'm done. Again, have not heard another equity expert who says like, I'm done learning. We can't be done learning.
Right.
I think that my whole point in philosophy is that I have to listen to others in order for me to grow. And that also means that I ask my students for feedback on how they felt treated as well as how they liked my programs. And I will say I've been at my current job for 3 years, and my first year that was shocking to a lot of students, and they felt uncomfortable because they hadn't had a lot of teachers explore some of these things. But by my 3rd year now, when I tell my students to be honest, they're kind of brutal, and that's amazing. And they'll say like, no, that project felt kind of jumbled or unorganized. Or I do tell my students from the get-go, my deadlines have to be flexible because some projects might take longer than others and some might take like a lot less. And where we have ill-defined problems, that is the case. So they have to be okay with, hey, we're going to cut this short a little bit, or we're going to give you 3 more weeks because I messed up, because I want them to be able to finish something. So their feedback is important, and having them be able to express that in a very safe way. And I hope that they agree with me on this, but it makes it a much better classroom to be part of, because they don't have to worry that I'm going to get insulted if they say they hated something or that they didn't really feel comfortable when I brought something up. That needs to be something that they can address, because when we're doing the equity work, we also don't want to make it so that our students are uncomfortable. So we have to provide safe spaces. And the only way to know if that is a safe space is to ask them if it is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It resonates. So I identify non-binary and was hosting a panel discussion at the Equity in Action Summit. And everybody on the panel existed outside of the male-female binary. And one of the things they did bring up was the thing that you just said. So like the pronoun may be different one-on-one versus in the class versus at home. And that was something that I hadn't even considered, because I had parents who would support that. Like they wouldn't question that, and I didn't need to worry about that. And the students that I've worked with who have shifted pronouns in the class or asked for a different pronoun were college students. So I haven't had K-12 students ask for that. So in my own experiences, I didn't even think about that. And I exist as a non-binary individual. So like I'm still learning through that as well. A really good point that you had with that. One of the things that you mentioned with COVID and this last summer, like preparing for the unknown, essentially, for what this year was going to look like. I'm curious, how have you, not just in this last year, but also broadly speaking in the field of education, what have you done to kind of take care of yourself and to try and prevent that burnout that is often pervasive within the field?
So I didn't avoid the burnout completely, as I am stepping out of the classroom for a bit, but I did take a job that was educational in nature, because I still want to coach and I still want to teach. And I am an educator, and that's who I am. So I didn't avoid the burnout as much as I wish I would have. But I will say that I am lucky in that I think that the classrooms that I had built were a lot easier to exist in a COVID world than if I had to redo everything. What I mean by that is, yes, my robotics classes are difficult. One of my classes we could do because we have robots for each child and we kept it at under 10 because we very generously, Revolution Robotics donated those robots. So we were able to do that. We couldn't do all trimesters because between trimester 1 and 2, for example, there was only one day. We couldn't clean everything, get everything ready for the next group. So trimester 2, we adapted the class. Trimester 3, we're back at the robots because 3 months have gone by and now we can use the robots again. But one of the things is my 7th and 8th grade classes, we didn't have enough robots to kind of run that. And we have a lot more students who wanted the class. So I can't have 18 individual robots, for example, or 24. So those classes were adjusted to be something more computational. And so we do some simulations, but we also do other things. I created something where we are always working around problems. So we address some problems, and that may be an ill-defined game-based problem, or it can be something else. That's easily adaptable, or a lot easier than if I am married to, I have to have my smartboard in front of me, a projector and a whatever, and the materials that I have in the room. Or because I adapt my classes to be very individualistic, I feel like I didn't make as many changes or concessions as I would have had if I was 10 years ago me. In that respect, I think I got lucky. I think my students are still having fun. They're still getting in trouble for doing stuff for my class in other classes, which I always find fun. It's interesting because when I get a complaint from a teacher like, I caught your student working on their Minecraft project, I have to respond, I'm so sorry, I'll talk to him. And inside I'm like, yes, they were interested. I am very proud of the fact that my students continue to work even though they don't have homework. So those kinds of things, I think my classes are easier to adapt to whatever it is that's thrown at them because of the way that they are set up. But at the same time, it takes a toll to have to teach as many classes. I'm also helping with the instructional piece a lot. How do I use technology in the classroom? I've run quite a bit of PD in my school this year, helping with some of the DEIJ stuff with our director of DEIJ and some of the counseling pieces with our counselor, with our learning specialist. I partner with a lot of people in the school just to make sure that we have what we need. And I do, I've been lucky because, again, my administration is super supportive of what it is that I do. And so we've been sharing as much as possible with others so that it can maybe hopefully help them adjust and adapt in an easier way. But would I want to do this whole year again? Not in a million years, not as an educator. It's been too much, and somebody will inevitably fall through the cracks because we have students on screen. We have students in the room. I said this recently, I got to a point with a student where they finally shared, their passion for anime, etc. And I had such a fun conversation with the student. And I was so excited. And we were talking, a couple of us teachers were talking. And I said, I finally got through to this kid. And we had this amazing conversation. And then I said, but yet I know that the 6 months it took me to get here, it would have taken me a month if we were in person.
Right.
That's the piece that I miss the most is I want that connection with my students. I have a really good connection with some of them because some of my students are in multiple classes with me. So I have had students who I've seen every single trimester for the last 3 years. But there's others who are new and I still don't know them as well.
Right.
And that's the part that's difficult as an educator because our connections to our students are so important. And for me to know them as individuals in this setting is hard.
What do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices, either for this past year, this upcoming year, or just in general?
I don't know because we had never been faced with this. So I don't know that there's a right answer to this. I wish teachers were involved in the decisions much more than they were. And I think that that's the piece where I am most disappointed with. It's that it felt we had no voice. And it felt like decisions were being made outside of any consideration for how that would affect teachers. Again, I'm very lucky. I am working from home, even though my students are in school for medical reasons. But the teachers who are in school, they basically have no planning periods. They're working nonstop to cover each other. When there's somebody sick, when there's somebody gone, when a family member is sick and they have to go take care of them, when all those little things that used to happen before COVID are 1,000 times harder now because it's also harder to find substitutes.
Right.
To go into a classroom and take that risk. And it's also not ideal. My kids are stuck sitting in a room, and I'm in a progressive school where students always moved around, and it was a very lively, happy place. And I don't see that as much this year. And that's soul crushing for me because students, they're exhausted by the end of the day when there's so many protocols to be found and followed. And I'm wearing a mask all day. I have to keep my distance from my friends, and I have to always be on, which takes physically a toll on students. They get tired, and that's not something that you can control, and it might not be the best scenario. And, I've heard every excuse in the book, but the truth is they're tired, and we made no changes. So if a student is that exhausted where they're falling asleep at 2:00, then why are we going further than 2:00? And could we have changed some of that? Could we have given them a day at home throughout the week to recover? Could we have made sure that maybe classes were shorter so that teachers could actually have some time in the afternoons to prep and recover? Should we have done that? And my answer to that would be absolutely yes, we should have done that. We didn't. And so we have exhausted people and exhausted students and complaints about learning loss, which whatever that means, because we've set up these artificial finish lines that we must complete, but every school has a different finish line. But everybody's talking about some sort of learning loss. And we live in a society that hasn't really acknowledged that we're in a pandemic and things are going to be different. And different is not necessarily bad. Whether or not the students have a learning loss, look, they're going to catch up. Whatever catching up means, I don't want to talk about catching up. I want to say their learning is going to be different. And that might actually be a good thing.
If you were to reach out to the people who are listening and say, hey, I could really use help with blank, what would that blank be? So if a listener might be able to assist with something or help answer a question or collaborate on something.
I don't have a specific thing that I would say that's my thing. I would say I am a huge proponent of these unofficial learning networks. There's a group of us that follow each other on Twitter, and there's groups I stay away from the Facebook groups, but there are some that are great, I hear. But part of this thing is we're doing some really cool work in some very spread out areas of this country, for example. And we do not have to do that alone. And we do not have to have these conversations only with the people around us. And so what I would say is if anybody wants to have a conversation or create a network or something, that's where I would like to be included. I am always looking for people who are doing cool stuff in the classrooms and using that to our advantage in terms of I learn from other people and I adapt that to what my classroom is, because we are, again, spread out. And so something that worked really well for me might not work for somebody else. But it is that whole idea of, hey, I loved what you did, but I adapted it this way. I want to hear that. I want to hear what it is that worked, what didn't, how you're adapting, what your students say. That's the piece where I think, if anybody's willing to have those conversations, that's where I want to be. I want to learn more from others because I am nowhere near perfect. And so I'm not looking for perfection. That's a no. But just like I'm not trying to be somebody's expert. I may have some expertise, and I'm not a great fan of any of those kinds of words. I am a learner. And one of the things that I will tell my students is I will learn with you if I don't know the answer to something. I will look for help. I am a proponent of saying I don't know to students. I'm not Google. I don't have all the answers. So those are the types of things where it's I don't know all the answers. So I want to have as many groups of people who want to have these conversations to get into a room and have those conversations. And that room might look like a Twitter feed, and it might look like a group in Facebook, or it might look something else. But those are the things that I think help me the most, is having those conversations with people who are doing the work in different areas, different scenarios, different schools, and we talk about that these are artificial groups of friends. And yet some of the people that are those artificial friends that, I've never met in life are people who have had some of the most impact in my room and my practices. It says something about what that can do for a teacher, an educator, regardless of how much they get put down. These are groups of people who can help so much. And so that's what I want people to kind of think about, that we don't need to stay within our groups or our local communities, etc., to learn, because some of the best work might be 2 states down. And how do I find that out? Is by having conversations.
Yeah, and I don't know about for you, but in most of the schools I've worked in the classes I was teaching, I was the only teacher on that campus that taught that class. So in order for me to find others who knew anything about the content area, I had to actually go outside of that bubble, outside of that physical space. So that's a really good point.
So on that, my boss, the director of where I'm at, and she's amazing. Again, I will say that 1,000 times. She partnered me, because I'm a one-woman show, with another one-woman show at the school who was the art teacher. And Emily Joyce and I presented some of this in the Equity in Action Summit, but we developed what these competencies were that we wanted our students to kind of think through when they're creating their goals for the trimesters. But Emily and I had my favorite collaboration those 2 years that we worked together. She left to be an artist full time. And she was the art teacher and I was the computational thinking teacher. And yet our partnership was probably my favorite of all time. We taught a class together that we had to do during COVID times, but it was art and tech. And so how do we create art that has some technology in it? We also taught a 1 week, what some schools call mini masters and what others call, we call it insights. It's a 1 week where students get to choose one class and they take that class all day, every day for 1 week. Emily and I taught one that was cardboard costume design, which was fun. And then the next year we did cosplay all day, which was very anime heavy. But we got to collaborate in things that most people wouldn't say are your typical partnerships.
Yeah.
She and I, in most schools, art and tech don't communicate. And yet when others were having department meetings, Emily and I were meeting. And so I think that that's the kind of stuff where schools need to just break down that whole division of subjects and stuff, where people can talk about more than just the content and curriculum in their classrooms. I love to see what the science teachers are doing. There was a humanities project that was really cool because the kids could choose how they presented their work. So some created a playlist of songs that talked about whatever book they were reading. Others had essays that they submitted. Others had a visual representation, so some art that they used to talk about that book. When you create options like that, your students show up more of who they are as individuals. And I would never know that that project even existed unless we had a conversation about it as a group, instead of the departments meet and that's the only people that they talk to. And that's not the philosophy that I want to follow. As an educator, I want to learn from everybody, not just the CS teachers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I like that reframing of it. In hindsight, I should have reached out, especially to the 2 music teachers that we had on campus, because all my degrees are music education. If anyone could have made those connections between music and computer science, I could have done it. But I didn't do that. I was reaching out to the other computer science teachers in the district. So yeah, hindsight 2020.
Yeah. And now there's I don't know if you've seen it, a ear sketch from Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
It's still a work in progress. I want to see more depth into the teacher aspect of all things on that. But I love that they use Python with the library to do some music composition, and my kids adore it. So those kinds of things that we can do in the classroom. But if I wanted to talk about composition of music, if this wasn't a COVID year, we had already planned on having the music teacher, one of them, come in to talk about what makes a good song, because he has a ton more knowledge about that. Even though I studied a lot of music, I sang for the San Juan Philharmonic, I sang with the Handel Choir Baltimore. I've done quite a bit of music myself, but it's all classical. And it was all about the voice, where My coworker, he's a musician. Like, he knows composition. He knows how to create for students. That's a different perspective. I don't need to know everything in my classroom. I can bring somebody else to teach the parts that I don't know. But those collaborations are only possible when we are provided the opportunities to talk to each other. And my school does a pretty brilliant job of that. But there's others where I've been where faculty meetings, we were not allowed to speak. It was whoever was leading the meeting, and it was a quiet meeting, and you sat there for an hour and then you left. And then the other meetings were department meetings. So all the math teachers talking together about math. That has not provided any insight into other things. So I do think that as schools, we need to move into a different world. When I was a student, because I'm older, we had to learn some things because there was no computer, there was no Google. There are some things that I absolutely needed in order to succeed. That is not this world. In this world, the information is there. What my students really, really need is how do I get the information that I need, and how do I digest, and how do I associate that information? How do I take what I need but not what I don't need? How do I interpret, analyze, and get to those conclusions? That is much more important in this society than memorizing a whole bunch of historical data. The history is important. The real history is important, super important. But the memorization of it isn't.
Right.
So I can stop spending time doing that, spend a lot more time talking about why things happen and how does that relate to what we're seeing now? And what are the cycles? History is very cyclical. We have a pandemic now. 100 years ago, there was another one. And if you go 100 years before, there are things that happen in a cycle. It's like the 500-year floods. Like, there's things that happen, and that's just because of the magnitude of it, not necessarily that it happens every 500 years, but it is because it happens sort of every 500 years or so. It's those cycles in history with nature, with the way that human beings behave, the wars, the whatever. You can look at that and learn about how those things repeat themselves and the things that lead up to those things, instead of in 1941, something happened. Who cares? Those are the types of things that I think need to change. It's the shift from memorization in traditional education to analysis.
Yeah, snaps over here on my end. That resonates.
And I love education, if you can't tell. I love to understand more about it, and I love to explore things because, again, I'm not an expert in all these areas. I am certainly not a historian. I've always loved patterns. And so that also means that I wasted a lot of years hating history because of the way that it was taught. And as an adult, I've started to love learning more about history because I now focus differently on it. But the only reason that happened is because I ended up observing a class where a teacher was talking about history very differently. And that's the piece that I think I want to keep repeating, and I want people to hear, is that we may be doing things that are working, but I guarantee you that there's somebody out there that's doing it better. And so how do we know that? It's by having those conversations, by observing other people, by talking to other people, because we should, just like I want my students to better themselves, to be better than themselves, to compete against themselves. I also want to be better. I also want to continue to learn. I also want to know what others are doing, not because I want to beat them, but because I want to beat me. I want to be the best possible educator I can be, not for me, because the better I am as an educator, the better the experience of my students. And that's the part that I think is important.
Yeah, I'm trying not to say the same thing over and over, but that definitely resonates with me. I really appreciate that. So where might people go to connect with you or the organizations that you work with?
I'm easily found on Twitter. It's the easiest way to find me. Direct message on Twitter will get you all my other contact information. And on Twitter, the Nerdy Geek with underscores under each word. My personal email is smargarita99@gmail.com. But again, if they need anything else, I'm more than happy to discuss, and DMs are open.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. If you enjoyed this particular episode, please consider sharing this and following Sophia on Twitter, or even providing a review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It just helps more people find this content. Stay tuned next week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode, and 2 weeks from now for another interview. I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.